You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Hello again, everyone. This is Doug Thorpe, and you're listening to another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Today, we're going to go back into the world of mental health. And when I do have this topic on this show, I always like to put a disclaimer on the front. I am not a licensed professional in this area, and I don't believe my guest is either, but I've got someone who has had his own experience with a struggle and is now formulated a message that he is sharing with others. He's got a new book that was released in July. We'll be talking about that. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Pat Broe. Pat, welcome to the show.
Doug, it's a pleasure to be on this morning.
Yeah, so as I kind of alluded to, let's start by sharing a little bit of your story so that we have a little bit of a level set here.
Absolutely. So I was, as a teenager, someone who struggled really deeply with mental health issues. I was a military kid that had moved around the country a lot, struggled a lot with my identity, who I was, who I wanted to be. And fell into a lot of the classic pitfalls that we're seeing hit across young people across the nation. Despite my bald head, I'm 27 years old. So I really fall into kind of that digital hybrid model where social media and the advent of communication-based technology really took off when I was in high school. And the mental health issues that we can certainly get into, but I think they're nominal for this conversation, culminated in me attempting to take my own life when I was 16 years old. And that was really my rock bottom. And over the next 5 years, I really began to work on myself and understand what was going on. First of all, at a macro level, what were these things affecting me? Why was I feeling this way? But also, what can I personally do to better myself, and what literature and worldviews are out there that can actually empower me in my own life? And half decade later, I've got a #1 internship in the country, top 5 hardest job interviews to get out of college. I've got a job offer. I've got friends that I love. I've got relationships that I love. I'm living in happiness and being the truest, most confident form of myself. And I really felt like the last lie that I was living was that I hadn't told people the story of what I had gone through as a teenager. And so I published an article when I was 22 years old in the year 2020 about my struggles with mental health, me overcoming them, and then where I was in life now. If anything, just because I didn't want to tell that story to 400 people over and over again, it just felt like an easier mechanism. So I published that article, and it went about as viral as the written word can go in the modern day. And the surprising piece of it was not, people reaching out, obviously saying, I'm sorry that happened to you, all that kind of stuff, which was not what I was searching for. But the amount of people in my peer group and older who said, I'm going through the same things. What can I do to get better? And really the how piece was the part that I left out of the article. What exactly did I do to get better? And so I wrote this book called The Real Confident You about, okay, what did I do to get better? What were those macro forces that I identified that were really affecting me? How did I get better? And then how did I ultimately help others? And so that's what brings me here to you today, Doug, and I'm excited to talk.
Well, I really appreciate that story. And I don't know. It always feels shallow to say congratulations on that journey or the success, but it's kind of like the proverbial thank you for your service to the military. I mean, it's an acknowledgement and a genuine appreciation for the struggle and the journey. But so as you have begun telling that story, what are some of the key hows that people can think about to kind of climb out of that pit, that rock bottom, and begin the journey to better health?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost thing people need to identify is what are the inputs going on in their life. And, I start by saying typically that there was a study conducted in 2019 that said that 1 in 5 high school students had seriously contemplated taking their own lives. But where does that leave the other 4, right? If that's the leading indicator, what's the lagging indicator? And so something seriously has fundamentally changed in all of our lives. And a lot of it is the inputs that we're putting into our own bodies, whether that's the news we consume, the social media we consume, the food we consume, how we consume, all of that kind of stuff, right? And so I'd say the number one thing that people need to focus on first is their inputs. What kind of information am I pulling in from social media, and how is that affecting my life? What kind of food am I eating? How am I going about eating my food? How am I going about taking care of myself? A lot of those initial pieces that have led to a lot of these issues. Jonathan Haidt did great work on this with the anxious generation and the coddling of the American mind. Most of these issues are really are people not being able to get out of their own heads and going into a device in their hands that they're going to get less stressed or get less anxious or get less depression. It's making actually those feelings and emotions worse. And so anything we can do to manage those inputs is typically where I start people down the path.
Well, man, so many things I want to touch on here, and I do want to stress to my audience, I think this is an important issue for leaders in all walks of life, whether it's formally in a position of authority in a business or informally as a community leader, volunteer, whatever. The awareness and sensitivity to the fact that so many of our fellow human beings struggle in this arena. And I think it's probably safe to say, although I confess I haven't read a study about it, but I think it's safe to say in the journey through life, everybody experiences highs and lows that particularly in the low point where you might take some time to get out of it. And I think about tragic events like divorce or death of a loved one, loss of a child, things like that, the usual immediate impact is a kind of depression. But then if that lingers, it spirals not upward, but downward into deeper, darker things that really impact quality of life and the ability to, step out and relate to others.
Yeah, completely. And, most people feel depression in scenarios like you mentioned, right? In areas of life where there's some sort of drop in social life, some sort of big tragedy in their own life. And the thing that's changed over the last 20 years is that when someone goes through something like that, they don't open up their phone and see some fake version of everybody else living the happiest life they possibly could, right? They don't lose their wife tragically and then open up Instagram and there's a lovely, husband and wife who really are arguing at home all the time and hate each other and whatever it is, but they look like they're living this smiley, happy life. So people, unfortunately, when they're in those dark times, are then viewing a really distorted view of reality that other people are living that makes those things even worse.
Yeah. I know my wife and I have our own running debate about the presence of social media. You look at Facebook and Instagram in particular, and of course TikTok, I guess, is in the realm too, Pinterest even to some degree. But the whole idea of that fake life that people are living, you see the pictorial chronologue of events and situations, and we know people that have posted things, and it's like, that's not what your life's about. Come on, what are you doing? What is the driver and motivation to try to paint such a rosy picture when that's not really what your life represents?
My favorite example is LinkedIn, just because of just how comically exaggerated most things are on LinkedIn. Everybody is humbled and grateful every time they get a new job or every time they leave an old job. Every job announcement is they become the Dalai Lama with how gracious they are in the new role or the old role or whatever it is, right? And I get it; it's a professional context. You can't exactly be 100% your authentic self, but the levels of inauthenticity they get deeper by the day.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess the question I've got that I have heard among my own peers and leaders that I work with, let's start with this notion of a child in elementary, middle, or even high school, a younger person that says they are stressed and pressured. There are those who have live more revolutions around the sun, and they look at that and say, what possible stress could you have being at that age? You have no idea what stress is.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's easy to pass that off too. Even as I've gotten older, sometimes it's hard to look at a 16-year old and go, kid, you've got it made. Like you've got everything you could ever want, right? But I think what older generations don't understand, I think they're starting to understand it more because they're starting to feel it in their own life as social media gets adopted through older generations, is it's fundamentally to change the way that kids interact with each other. The problem at school, the bullying at school, whatever it is that's happening, doesn't leave you the day when the bell rings and you leave the schoolhouse. It follows you home on your phone, and these kids are feeling serious amounts of pressure at all times to, as a woman, be a literal replica of the Venus de Milo, or as a man to be simultaneously Hugh Hefner in a Green Beret and whatever macho masculine version of a man can be. So for these kids, the pressure to be excellent in every facet of their life that they just can't match up to is tremendous. And we see the results of this. I mean, if you look at the advent of social media and you look at, let's say, a graph of teen girls and their depression rates, if you look at the year Instagram ends up on every girl's smartphone, we've seen spikes, just significant spikes. I mean, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60% in teen girls' depression, right? And there's a reason for that. And so for parents, I think, and for leaders working with kids, I think the best thing that you can do is, one, empathize with them, but also have an understanding of getting them back to a reality and showing them how important they are in their communities, or where their stresses are valid or where they're not valid, and that they're wanted and seen, and where they can work towards to actually find a real identity for themselves.
I wonder, I know much has been talked about in the idea of identification and awareness of these issues and problems. I have a good friend and colleague who works in the North Texas area in the Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex, and specifically in the town of Allen. His county, I believe it's Collin County, has had an initiative that's been going on for a couple of years now. They've joined forces between mental health care providers, hospitals, schools, first responders, and a couple of other constituencies. And they've explored ways to break down some of the artificial and sometimes legal walls, like, for instance, HIPAA. If a any person, it doesn't have to be a young person, but if a person submits to treatment, they're protected by HIPAA, yet depending on the diagnosis, it could be a real and present threat to a community, like a school or a neighborhood. And having first responders aware of it, school administrators aware of it, it becomes a very hard discussion to have about the difference between privacy, labeling, all of the things that create other kinds of problems, but still has value in awareness, in the spirit of providing support. Let's support this individual if they have self-selected and said, I need help. Let's get all the right constituencies together to provide the help that helps the individual and protects the community from any, subsequent horrible action that could potentially happen. And I think it's an amazing initiative, and it's been painful. It's been long in the making, but they've even elevated up to the point they've got the ear and eyes of the state governor here in Texas, and some others who are trying to, if they have to, change the law to allow certain things to be communicated, while still trying to run that delicate balance of privacy and confidentiality. So it's a very tricky dynamic to think about. But I think the bottom line is a lot more people who need the help are getting the help, and creating a better community because of it.
Yeah, and two, right? You don't want to isolate the kid such that any other kid who needed the help wouldn't then not reach out for the help, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so it is a delicate balance to play. And the other point too is the safety piece of it, right? There are situations in which that person is a harm to themselves or potentially other people, and being delicate about that balance is
So let me ask you, as you think back and think about your journey,
Mhm.
what is it you wish other people around you would have either paid attention to or acted upon as you were in the darkness, so to speak, as you were in the lower rungs of your journey to try to climb out of that pit?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that's most interesting to me is that I'm not sure if there's much anybody else could have done except for in a pure like let's act and get this kid help issue. Once those issues started happening, I would have never gone to anybody for help, right? I was too either proud or my ego was too high. And I think as communities, what we need to do is a little bit more downstream. And we need, a lot of these mental health issues are not, those sharp upticks are not because of we have a new base of people that are more genetically inclined to have mental health issues. It's because something fundamentally about the fabrics of our communities have changed. And so when I look back, I think things like the self-esteem movement probably affected me pretty significantly. For people who don't know what that is, in the late 70s and early 80s, that's the everybody gets a participation trophy award. And the building of self-esteem among young people that's not anchored in any reality of I need to work hard for something to actually feel something about myself. We're creating a generation of emotional hemophiliacs who, when something bad happens, they have no built up tolerance to failure that you should have in first grade and second grade of, hey, I didn't do great on my spelling test, and so I need to go back and work hard at it. And so when they get into real throes of life, maybe in high school or in college, um, and something bad happens, they have the right equipment inside of them to actually deal with those forces, to deal with failure, and to understand that it's not a bad thing. It's actually a positive thing in most people's lives. But a lot of what my book does and what I've had to do with people is reteach those things, right? To not be scared. There's an interesting statistic that came out of MIT that a lot of the professors, they have these really smart, brilliant kids who are just really scared to put themselves out there and try at things, right? Because they're so scared of failure. And so there's something fundamentally wrong there in how we build the self-esteem of our youth. And I think that's what really could have been the biggest difference for me is, I grew up with a military father. We worked really hard. All that stuff. But I think within the classroom setting, right, the inability to actually build a proper self-esteem in the old school way really affected me.
I think that's really interesting that you talk about that, and I know there are periodic posts on social media from my generation as a boomer that goes back to the things, we didn't wear bike helmets and knee pads, and we stood in the front seat of a car as a young child. We didn't have a car seat, and we didn't even have a seat belt. It was like and were there some tragic injuries along the way? Yes, no doubt. But did the vast majority survive? Yeah, we sure did. And it does create a whole different paradigm about the notion of try and fail, and realize that it's not going to be the end of the world. You just got to get up and try again. That's the equation. But finding a healthy way to teach that to the masses. I know I've got my own now adult children who have become educators, and the whole education system is geared largely toward passing the aptitude test.
Exactly.
They're not teaching the fundamentals, they're teaching to pass the test,
Mhm.
because that is the focus of everything.
Mhm.
And it really does concern me about the absence of some critical thinking ability to look at a situation, ask the right questions, be curious about possible extra input that can inform a good, solid decision, that whole process is seemingly not being modeled or shared in the classroom. And that gravely concerns me, because that's the common denominator for all of us in how to navigate through life. You have to make some critical decisions every now and then.
Well, kids often will complain, like, why am I learning algebra, right? And when am I going to use algebra in life? Well, you're not going to use algebra in life. But what you're going to use in life is the ability to problem solve. It becomes an application of problem solving, right? Why do I need to read Macbeth? You probably will never use Macbeth in your life, but reading something really hard and being curious about it and learning how to understand something that's foreign to you is the thing that you're going to take away from it. And so when we take the actual critical elements of education out of it, the downstream effects that we're supposed to get from it, right? How to think is what you're supposed to walk away with, not how do I fill in a bubble. But I think we create a duller generation. It's funny, I was just reading an article not too long ago, again, about Ivy League students. They seem to be in the news a lot lately. But how none of them have ever read a book before. I mean, we're talking about some of the most brilliant kids in America, and they're being tasked with, in English class, with reading, serious classical books, and they have no reading comprehension because they're not reading books. They're spark noting their way through high school.
Yeah.
And so we're fundamentally failing our kids in a lot of areas, and we're performing, along with the educational system, performing some sort of crazy social experiment on them, allowing them to be so interconnected to the world at such a young age.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a very troubling concern. I was asked a couple of years ago by a young lady who had children coming up, and she and her husband were opting to homeschool, which is fine. I've got a lot of thoughts on that, but she asked me, she said, you're well read and, versed in a lot of things. What do you think is one of the most important things I ought to be thinking about for the kids as they go to homeschool? I said, help them learn critical thinking.
Yeah.
And her face kind of glassed over, and she said, what is that?
Yeah.
And I went,
Yeah.
I thought, oh no, here we go.
Uh-oh.
A generation handing off to another generation something that they themselves have no concept of.
Yeah.
It's like, wow. Okay. Well, so anyway, we did have a discussion. I helped her understand what I was saying, and I think it's worked out. But well, let's turn the table a little bit to back to the whole idea of what can a leader do to be aware, be supportive, be vigilant for the people around them.
Yeah, I think the first and foremost, the most important thing a leader can do is take care of themselves, right? If you're not 100% present in the best version of you, then anybody you're leading is not getting the best version of you, right? So whatever you can do to constantly assess where you are in terms of your life, and it doesn't have to be something like happiness, but how well am I outputting right now? Am I able to give my 100% in whatever path it is, right? Whether you're a leader of a family, a organization, a church organization, the local bake sale, or a Fortune 500 organization, your ability to be the best version of yourself is critical for accomplishing your goals. And if you're being held back by anything, whether it's a vice, whether it's depression, whatever it is, you need to be able to constantly address that so people are getting the best version of yourself. I think the second and most important thing is just to be aware of the macro factors of how many people you're probably dealing with that are going through something. And it doesn't have to be a mental health issue, but there's something going on in every one of those people's lives. I'll go back to that 1 in 5 kids stat just because I think it's so powerful. That stat was taken in 2019. That's your entry level workforce now. Those kids are all through college. Those are all your interns. Those are all of your first year employees. That's anybody you're dealing with in their 20s. And that generation is only going to get older, and people in their 30s are dealing with things similar. People in their 40s are dealing with things similar. And so whatever you can do to be empathetic and be authentic to them, because they're in such an inauthentic world, is a great starting point for being a great leader.
Well, I know some of the, Fortune 500, even Fortune 1000 companies have been far more proactive lately in providing programs to support mental health issues. And they're working genuinely and earnestly to lift the stigma, recognizing that this is a reality for many individuals, just as traditional medical issues may be, like heart conditions or high blood pressure or other things that you go see an MD for. And kudos to them for lifting the lid on that. I think we still have a lot of mileage to cover. Things like there are still stipulations trying to get a life insurance policy. If you've ever declared for mental health support, you're probably disqualified from getting life insurance today. Yep. And that needs to be fixed. That it's not a question of did you, the question is how are you now? Where are you now? And so that's another whole debate to be had, maybe another day. But I think I like your point that leaders first need to take care of themselves. And I think mental health, mental strength, and agility and acuity in a very complex world. Take social media aside for just a minute in terms of a business leader. Just the complexity of how business operates now, the way we electronically move money, the way we track transactions, the way we schedule jobs. And I think of the home service professional that gets a call from a homeowner. Hey, I need my circuit board checked out. All of my fuses are blown. Well, there's an element of criticality in being able to get out there, and so scheduling a technician to go do the work. There's just a ever changing demand for urgency and time, and that in and of itself creates pressure that if you're the company owner of that business, if you're not careful, you're going to take all that on your own self, your being, and you're going to feel responsible for all of that. So there is a need to have a mechanism to properly assess that, properly manage it, and not let it become your own mental health deterrent.
Yeah, for a lot of leaders, I point them towards every leader in America has done a SWOT analysis of some kind of their organization, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Do it on yourself. Where do you sit on your own personal SWOT analysis? What value you're providing to your organization? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And have that honest conversation with yourself as much as possible. I think most normal leadership development actually points you in a direction of being a more mentally healthy person, just because you need to be mentally healthy to perform at your highest level. And then when it comes to dealing with people, I would say a great indicator of am I doing a good job of creating an environment that fosters positive mental health is, do you think any of your employees, anybody who's working for you, anybody that you lead, would feel comfortable with you personally as a person having a conversation about their mental health if they had a challenge? Do you feel like you're in a spot right now that someone would be able to approach you to say, hey, my grandma died, I need to take 3 days off, and they wouldn't feel like they were going to get the stick carried down on them?
Right.
I think that's a good baseline to start thinking where you can work from.
Right. And you touched on a point there, the leader creating the right environment for their people and their team. I often point to, in the book I've got here on my shelf, the Trust at Work book that a colleague of mine and I wrote back in 2020, actually, does cite the famous Google study, the Aristotle Project Aristotle is what they called it. And that was the one that famously introduced us to the term psychological safety in the workplace. They determined that it was the presence of psychological safety that allowed certain work teams to work at a higher level than all the other work teams. And of course, Google as a company is famous for hiring the best of the best. And it puzzled them back in roughly 2016. They said, why don't all our teams perform at the same level? and they had determined that they were not getting the same output from all of the work teams or project teams that were assembled. Some worked far better than others, so they started studying it. It was a 2-year study, very interesting, and determined it wasn't about the quality of the health snacks in the break room or the ping pong tables or the sleeping pods. It was this presence of this thing they called psychological safety that allowed every individual of the team to show up as their best self and not be ridiculed for being one way versus somebody else on the team, and kind of eliminating that peer pressure sort of thing, or the psychological bullying that can happen, as you mentioned, on the schoolyard. But rather it was a healthy environment. Somebody could speak an idea, it would get a proper hearing, and it would either be accepted or not. But when it was not accepted, it was done in a healthy way. It was like, good idea, and we can't fit that right now. Maybe we'll save that for another day, another project, another opportunity. And people could leave that environment feeling okay about the work, and then they were still energized and motivated to do what was to be done. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I haven't heard, I'm not aware of any studies about the mental health condition at Google. I know a lot of people do report burnout.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all part of that mental health and mental resilience.
Let me ask you, because you talk to so many leaders, and you touched on something there that I think a lot of leaders worry about when becoming an empathetic leader or a servant leader, or working in service of the people that they're leading, is the idea that they're going to get taken advantage of. Being empathetic, being a good person means that there's going to be someone that's going to try to take advantage of that, take extra days off when there's nothing actually going on, or they continue to have problems, whatever the situation is. We all can envision it, right? And we all know people who would be apt to do that to a leader that's kind and empathetic. So from who you've talked to, what do you think is the answer to that question of how do you know when someone's taking advantage of you, and how you know when, okay, this person really needs my help?
I think that's a great question, and I do think it's a critical one leaders need to think about. And I have not been shy on this program and in my own content sphere that I publish in my blogs. I have determined, and these are very broad brush statements I'm getting ready to make, but I actually have data that does support it, that from a leader's perspective, depending on the size of your team, your workforce tends to fall into 3 categories. So there's a third, and a third. Top third is your high performers, your A+ players, totally 100% reliable at all turns. And they're the ones that are most at risk for leaving because they can. Mm-hmm. And you've got to do one thing to work with them, keep them engaged, keep them motivated. Then you've got a middle third that is okay. I mean, they are technically fulfilling their job description, but it tends to show up in what you might think of as 4 out of 5 days. You're getting that good result. The 5th day, it's a little bit less than. It's not quite what you had hoped. Mm-hmm. It's okay, but it's not great, and it's that kind of thing. So the challenge from a leadership standpoint is, can you help make those people a little stronger? Can you move them into the top third category with a little extra training or encouragement? That's the challenge. But then you've got the proverbial last third. And these are the ones that are constantly testing the rails. They're not performing up to speed. They're not following the procedures. They're perpetually on some kind of remediation. Mm-hmm. And the quick issue there, and I'm speaking in, again, very a broad lens first, and I'll get to your question here. Mm-hmm. This other third is a challenge, but I think historically what leaders and business owners have not done well, they have not dealt with that group swiftly enough.
Mm-hmm.
They're on the payroll, but you're somehow afraid to just cut them loose because maybe there's a regulatory issue, maybe it's a union related matter. I don't know. There's a lot of drivers that create the delay in dealing with that. And I go back to Jim Collins' Good to Great, all the work and study he did. And one of the classic teachings out of that book is, get the right people on the bus. So it challenges your hiring process, your selection process, and your placement and onboarding process to not add people that aren't good fits for what you need to do at work. Now,
right.
So knowing that nobody's perfect in that hiring and onboarding game, sometimes you don't know what you're going to get. When you do try to put yourself out there as a servant leader, you are more compassionate and more grace giving to the people around you. But the one thing about servant leadership that I think a lot of people misunderstand, you still have to be firm.
Right.
You still have to be decisive when time calls for it, and you still have to act, swiftly and appropriately in the moment. So monitoring the idea of letting your employee have 3 days to go bury their grandmother. Okay. You take that first one at face value and you allow that to happen, but then you have to watch for patterns.
Mm-hmm.
You have to say, well, wait a minute. You just had another relative die? Really? I mean, that fast, that quick? Let's talk about that a little bit. And then if they show up with a third excuse along that line, it's like, okay, statistically, this really doesn't happen in
How many
families.
grandparents do you have? Yeah.
How many grandmothers do you have? Yeah. How many, and funny you bring that one up. I've actually had that exact thing happen. But I think it's more a pattern recognition and being sensitive to the issues. I think from my view, one of the classic indicators of someone that might be struggling, whether it's mental health or addictive behavior or anything like that, is simply attendance.
Yeah.
Do they come in late or leave early, or do they take long lunches? And how do they appear? Like if they showed up in the morning, they were on time, it was good. They go to lunch, and now it was a long lunch, and they come back and they're just 40 degrees off prime, and it's like, well, what did you do at lunch? What? And it all boils down in my mind to pattern recognition of saying, where do the differences show up? How often do they show up? Do they show up consistently at this time of day or on these events or after a weekend or whatever? And like I said, or for a lot of the companies that are more open and aligned for mental health support, then that's time to encourage somebody to take a referral, go talk to a professional.
Completely. Yeah. And what I'm hearing from you too, which I think is evidently true, is that being a servant leader or being empathetic with the people that work for you is not something that you can be overly dogmatic or procedural about, right? It can't be this person takes this many days off, I'll provide the stick when they take whatever days off. I think you have to take it person by person, understand how much value they're providing at work after those times or what's going on in their lives, and be a human and understand that.
Right.
I think it's, we all try really hard to fall as leaders to fall into systems as much as possible, just because we can replicate that, we can measure that. But there's no KPI on being an empathetic person. And so,
well, okay, and I want to share on that notion of being an empathetic leader. I had a guest on a recent episode that actually took me to school on this idea. And I have subsequently really pondered what was shared, and I have to agree. And the point was this: there's a big difference between being an empathetic leader and a compassionate leader. And in my guest's mind, she said, empathy will get you in trouble. And I said, really? How so? And she said, well, here's her version of it. If you're walking through a park and there's a swimming pool and you look and someone is drowning in the pool, in the literal sense of the word, if you're going to be empathetic, you're going to place yourself in their position, which they are flailing in the pool, sucking in water, they can't get their bearings. And if you're a leader and you go there, you now have disabled your ability to lead in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're compassionate, you say, oh my gosh, you're in trouble. I'm going to help. And I'll find a rope or a float or, some way to get you out and help rescue. So I've thought about that, and I do think this concept of having empathy and being an empathetic leader, which is well written. I mean, it's everywhere in leadership development training these days. I think it's a tricky concept that trips up too many people, and I really like her version of it better, and I've embraced it now. I'm gonna.
No, I think that's a really no. I think that's a really valid point that I don't think I had considered. But it's true, right? And certainly you're also, I think it's almost impossible to be completely empathetic with employees that don't have the same goals as you are, right? If you're a leader, inherently you're going to be just different than the people that you're leading most of the time. Right now, there's people that you'll see that are younger than you or younger in their career path that will mirror similar habits and behaviors to you that you're certainly going to want to mentor and bring up to your level. But it's hard to be empathetic to, if you're a hardworking leader, to someone who's like, hey, I just want to get in my 40 hours, clock in, clock out, and do a good job. Right. Call it a day. So I think there's a lot of gravitas there, and I think I'll chew on that during lunch today.
Think about it. Well, Pat, we're about up on time for today. Tell people the best way to get a hold of you if they're interested in learning more.
Absolutely. So if you're going through any mental health challenges currently right now, number one, I would say the first person you need to reach out to is a professional, but I'm happy to have a conversation with you. So please just reach out at therealconfidentyou@gmail.com, and I'll have a conversation with anybody. That I'm not trying to sell you a program or anything. I will just give you my phone number and we can hop on the phone and talk. I've done it a lot over the last 6 months, and I'm happy to do it for you if you need it. You can find me on Instagram at Pat Broe, or LinkedIn. You can just search my name, Pat Broe. You'll see my beautiful bald head pop up as the first image. And then you can find my book on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's called The Real Confident You, Advice from a 20-something Suicide Survivor. Happy to say it's a bestseller this year. We've made the ebook 99 cents specifically because we don't want price to be a inhibitor to people getting into this information. So it's basically free. Good. You can't stocking stuff in ebook, but if it's something that you really need and you're struggling with money right now, it's $1. So
great. Good stuff. Well, thanks again, Pat, for sitting in. And as always, folks, we'll have that information in the show notes. So when you're at a safe place to hop down and click online, find those links, you can reach out to Pat and check out his book. So I think for now, that's about it for today. I hope this has been helpful and given you some ideas and things to do to protect yourself, help yourself, and help those you might be leading. But with that, we're going to sign off, say goodbye, go out there, make it a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.